So we will start with David Torres, who is our first presenter. Please, David. Good morning. Thank you for being here for the first talk of the day. So, as the title indicates, I'm going to be sharing with you some ideas we've been working regarding how to try to distinguish between response patterns that are a product of a careless response style versus an actual meaningful class. So, to tell you a little bit about the context on how we ended up working on this, a brief introduction. Some of the people in the room are very familiar with this, but a couple of years ago, a book came out regarding good citizenship using IEA's International Civics and Citizenship Education Study. So for that book, we were working with indicators, self-reported indicators of good citizenship. Here you can see, I'm just going to read a couple, like to what extent you think it's important voting in every national election, showing respect for government representatives, engaging in political discussions. And all of them were answered by students with using Likert scales, 4-point Likert scales. And for purposes of this study, we are dealing with dichotomized data, basically whether they selected two of the endorsing responses versus the not endorsing responses. And for that book, we settled in a 5-class solution. We did exploratory and confirmatory analysis. And we got solutions that gave us very good classification probabilities for the different countries. So in general, I was happy, and I think that in general we were able to use that, and different authors throughout the book used it. And I invite you to download the book if you haven't already. It's an interesting contribution to the field. However, a little bit of time passed, and Diego Carrasco, a colleague of mine who is actively engaged in this area of research, came to me and mentioned that they were getting skeptical reactions in some presentations. In particular, we were getting an objection repeatedly that 2 of the 5 classes were probably not actual meaningful classes, but merely artifacts. And I was in principle unconvinced that this was a problem, but Diego convinced me that we should try to think how to respond to this issue. In particularly, the concern of people who pointed this out is that you have 2 extreme classes. You have a class of high endorsers that tend to say that they would agree in general with all of the indicators that we were presenting. And on the other hand, we have this low-performing class, if you will, that are people who say, no, I am not interested in endorsing any of the items. So the key point here is that you could make the case, as they were making it, that this is actually not a meaningful class. This is just you're capturing people who are uninterested in answering the survey, so they're just giving you no, 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 or in the case of the upper one, yes, 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 without actually paying any attention to the responses. Okay, so as Diego was pointing this out and we were starting discussions, my work in the past couple of years have been related to the use of latent class models and trying to combine them with item response and factor models. And I was working with a former student and now colleague in the area of response styles. I am plugging here 2 papers that I think might be of interest to you if you are interested in response styles. And we got very interesting results using latent class analysis in order to try to clean up. We have what now I see are perhaps somewhat controversial results, things to say regarding the use of the bifactor model, for instance. And we are putting forward the idea of latent class analysis as an interesting complement to the kind of techniques that are usually used in that case. So while this was happening, Diego mentioned this to us, and then we had some ideas based on the cross of these lines of research. So latent class analysis, response styles, and this idea that we were finding just artifactual classes. So the goal for today is tell you one of these ideas that we are working on. that we think might be an interesting additional tool to have at hand in order to detect these classes. And more importantly, this is work in progress, so we are particularly interested, I'm not using the royal we, I mean Diego and the rest of our co-authors, in getting some feedback or any suggestions that you may have. So, one problem that it's important to keep in mind when analyzing this particular data set is that a common way of trying to disentangle the issue of response styles, and particularly the extreme response styles, is that you usually want to have items that are inverted in your scale, and that should give you some clues regarding the abnormal patterns of responses. But in this specific survey section, we do not have any inverted items. So that's one less tool at our disposal in order to deal with this issue. So as a first approach, there is an entire literature in response files. I am not an expert in this. Fernando, my colleague, was the one that was interested in this particular topic. So he helped us in this area. And we decided to start by using the usual tools that apparently are well known in this literature. This is a summary of the 4 indicators that, as we understand, are pretty common to use. You have max long string, which is basically how long is the chain of responses in which you have exactly the same answer. You have the average string. You're trying to detect this idea of a straight liner with this indicator. The individual response variability, you're trying to analyze to what extent there is variance within a single respondent in order to try to detect anomalous behaviors. And you have the idea that you can use Mahalanobis distances in order to characterize the distances between the respondents. Again, all this is from the literature. This is just we're applying the tools that, as we saw, were standard. So just to give you a little more insight regarding the classes, because I'm going to be talking a lot about them, so to get you to remember them, we have this is from the draft analysis that we're presenting today. We have a class number 1, which is basically this bottom class, low proclivity to endorsing any of the items. And as the second class, I'm marking the upper one that arguably could be confused with someone who's straight responding. Okay? And please note that this class, I guess, hopefully is a meaningful fact that only 4.3% of the respondents in the entire study were in disagreement with all of the indicators. And we have, in general, high percentage of people, or relatively high percentage of people, answering that they are endorsing all of the items, or most of them at least. So that's class 1 for low, 2 for high. You have class a 5th class that you can think of a middle class here of 13.4%, people who are around a little above 50%. And then you have classes 3 and 4, in which I'm not going to go into detail here, but you have more distinctive patterns of areas that they are more or less interested in particular regarding these indicators. So to give you an example, in the case here for Italy, if we use the 5-class model, one thing that I want to highlight is that Italy, for instance, has a much larger percentage overall than the rest of the world for that class. We are seeing here for this solution in this analysis, around 70% of people of high endorsers and 1.3% of people in the low endorsement condition. And the question here is, to what extent can we think that perhaps this 70% is just grossly inflated because we are capturing people who were uninterested in the survey and they're just average, like straight responding? Or to what extent that might be misleading? So if we look at the traditional indicators, this is, remember, the low endorsing, high endorsing, and the other classes. I would say, immediately notice that this class is significantly different from the others. You have very, very different indicators in this case than the others. And the second class is different, but not, let's say, not as different as this one. Okay? We have higher indicators here of people answering a large amount of times the same thing, more than the other classes, but not as much as in this one. And that pattern you will see, I'm going to quickly present, this is the same thing with the average max long string, the individual variability response. This goes the other way around, but the same pattern. This one is much more extreme than the others, followed by the class number 2. Mahalanobis distance, to be honest, to us is not clear to what extent you can meaningfully interpret them. It's also the one that gives us the least distinct results. We found it to be the less useful in our case to try to identify it. So if you look at these 3 cases, you clearly see that there's more abnormal or atypical behavior in the classes that we are concerned. So the issue here, let me put it here for a second, is that to some extent this is giving information about the class being anomalous, but it's not really helping you out to decide clearly, or it's not giving you a criterion for telling when a respondent should be classified there or not. How are we going to distinguish between the people that you would think actually should be in that class to the extent that you believe there is a class, versus the people who are just straight responding? So we have these indicators that are already in the literature, but we, in a sense, wanted some alternative method that accomplish a couple of different things. So that's what I was saying. The problem is that the problematic responses that they are capturing could be attributed, as I was saying, to people in that class. And again, we have no way of deciding who to assign to this particular artifact versus the class. So we thought it would be good to try a model-based approach instead of an index to try to disentangle, to the extent that it would be logically possible, these 2 things. And how do we did that? And this is a very simple application of using a confirmatory latent class analysis. Is that we said we have a 5-class solution, but we can include in a confirmatory way 2 additional classes, class 6 and class 7. So here's the rationale for this. If you are telling me that you don't believe that this class and that class actually exist, but are the product of people just answering all zeros or all fours, what you should be able to see is that someone who answered all zeros straight should be more likely to be in this class that we have not included in our analysis, which is just 0 response, and the same for someone who is in the upper class. So if these are artifactual classes, what I would expect to see is that when I run the model with the 7 classes defined, people who were previously classified in this one should jump in terms of the classification probability to class 7. 1 should go to 7, and class 2 should go to class 6. Any questions so far? We're doing in time. Okay. So these are the results. These are the absolute numbers to give you an idea of the people that I was considering the analysis. And this is what we're getting. So here, I'm very happy. We have 100, 99.8, 99.4. You can see that basically very few cases are actually moved around in the classes that are not the classes of interest. This is a result of rearranging all the probabilities. But in the 2 classes that we're interested, which is the first and the second, this is what we're seeing. We're seeing that class 2 remains pretty robust, and then again, it's a large class, but 95% of the people in that class remain there and are not moved around. One thing that is interesting is that we only take half, approximately, of those into the class 6, which was our original hypothesis, but we also have rearrangements for some of them to class 3, which is not something that we were expecting. But again, I would highlight the fact that a great majority of people remains in the class and are not more likely to be classified in the one that we were selecting. However, the upper class, the lowest class does have this significant switch. So people who were low respondents, only around 3 out of 4 remain in the class that we were originally putting them, and 1 out of 4 moves to this decoy class that we're introducing to detect if this is happening. One thing that I want to point out, though, is that the method obviously is not doing any magic. It's just telling you whether it's likely that you actually made that pattern of responses. It can be the case that I actually did not endorse any of the things and I was committed to thinking it was 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. In a sense, behaviorally, I cannot distinguish someone who's a true believer in not answering and not agreeing versus someone who's just bored. But what we're seeing here is that at the very least, 3 out of 4 people that we were thinking were in this class remain, even though I give the possibility of rearranging them, and in the other class, 95% remain. This is just to illustrate the classes, the relation. So this is what we're seeing overall. What is happening is that the first class is reduced by 1%, and that 1% goes mostly to class 7. This is just another way of presenting the same results that I did before. And again, class 2 is reduced by a bit, around a little less than 10%, and that moves to some extent to class 6, but there's also a rearrangement in the other classes. If we look at the case of Italy here, what we see, and I find this very interesting, is that if the original concern was that I had an inflated 70% class, turns out that, and this is consistent with the class 2 being very robust, I actually have no one reclassified in class 6. So that result sort of is strong in face of this alternative test. However, class 7, I do have that within that class, more than half of the people are actually moved into this category. So this would be potentially suspicious cases. Again, this may also include someone who really thinks that that's the way to respond, but we can isolate at least those cases and look at the 0.5% in the other class. Here we can see how the classification probabilities look. This is the original plot with 5 classes. You see that classes 1 and 2 have these strange patterns regarding people who are classified. Once I use this alternative model, the classification probabilities look much more reasonable for those classes, so in a sense that improves the quality of the assignment in there. And these 2 classes are capturing basically the cases that were located in these areas here. And class 6 has these abnormal behaviors, picking up a very particular kind of pattern with low variability. And if you look at the indices very quickly that I was showing before, you remember this looks highly extreme. You can see that the median is over there. After this, again, is extreme, but it's considerably less so than in the original. And that pattern repeats basically for all of the others, that these 2 classes are sort of bringing the indexes more in line with the other responses. So, in sum, I think I'm well done. We think confirmatory relating class analysis approach can be a valuable way of including this as part of the, let's call it the arsenal of techniques that we can use in order to examine and see how possible it is that we are just detecting artifactual classes. And we are now planning to identify which kinds of problematic response patterns are better capturing this method. And we are also looking to apply this to other parts of the ICCS survey. And that's pretty much all I have for today. Thank you very much.